right, welcome back, students and Jennifer, who we just talked about last module, all about risks. Now we're going to talk about how we mitigate those risks, which is by this term controls. And we're going to use the general term internal controls, meaning that these are controls we put in place inside an organization to mitigate those risks. And controls are different activities. We'll talk about some of the different activity types of controls that you can have. But Jennifer, real quick, just tell us your overall definition of how you would define controls to an outsider or someone at your organization, new to your organization, maybe.
Yep. So I like to think of internal controls as any action that management or somebody takes to mitigate a risk. So to prevent it from happening or to detect it, not to give away.
Yeah, yeah.
Prevent it or detect it from, occurring. So.
Yeah, well, let's go into that next then. So there are various different ways we can categorize or put types to controls. And you mentioned one of those. So preventative, obviously, just by that term, this is something that is an activity that's going to happen before the risk would even occur, right? So you're going to get in front of that. And then detective would detect if it actually happened. So could you, maybe tell us an example of that? I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but
sure. So a really common one that we see and look out for quite often is a review of something like a journal entry or something before a transaction is recorded, right? So that review, because it's happening before it's recorded in the financial system or before an action takes place, you're going to catch it before it is a problem, right? So preventive. A detective control, that might be something like a reconciliation on the back end, right? If we're talking about financial type controls. So we are recording transactions at the end of the month. We go back and we reconcile to make sure that everything got recorded and that, we have kept track of everything. And that's at a company, you can do the same type of thing in your personal life too, right? Hopefully most people are still balancing their bank accounts and things like that. So that's on the back end. So those are detective, where you would hope to not find a charge on your credit card that you don't recognize or whatever.
Yeah, no, I like that. So yeah, perfect other example of going with kind of the bank account is like if a company physically has somebody writing checks still, which I don't know if that still happens in today's world, they might have somebody review that check before it's even mailed, right? This is appropriate. A lot of times you'll see that as almost like 2 layers of authorization. And that's really a preventative control before that check goes out the door to a vendor that maybe we shouldn't be paying or we've already paid or something like that. Whereas then, if they don't have that preventative control, that check goes out the door, then they see it once it clears the bank. And then they might catch it on the bank reconciliation and say, wait, we paid this vendor twice, but they're detecting that after the fact. So what I'm getting at here is for the students, obviously we want those preventative controls in place as much as possible. First and foremost, the detective ones are great. And in some instances, that's all you might be able to have. But we like to make sure there's 2 types of controls for a lot of processes.
Yeah, I have a really good example of it's related to vendor management that happened within our organization fairly recently. I think it was last year. We have a process in place where we kind of vet our vendors right before we load them up into our financial system to allow checks to be cut to them and that sort of thing. Part of that vetting process is looking at if they're an existing vendor and they try to make some sort of change, we contact whatever contact we had before, right? So we're not just going to take whatever new form that they send us. Mm-hmm. So we had a vendor submit something for a change of contact where they had changed the end of the email address from .com to .co.
Oh.
One letter. But because we have a process in place where we check and contact our previous contact, we caught it. And this was a very large capital projects vendor that we spend millions and millions of dollars with every year. So it seems like really small, right? Like, oh, it's one letter on a form, but had we not done that, we could have potentially paid the wrong person or the wrong company.
Wow, what an important control, and especially in today's
Yeah.
world where we talk about, all the scams that are out there and
Yeah.
phishing and, all of those ways hackers try to get into companies and get money out of companies, really.
Yep.
That's an awesome example of a real life control there. What about controls? Now, we've been talking about manual reviews. And another category of controls that we could put them into are buckets that are manual or automated. So
Yep.
talk us through the difference there in your world.
So one of the common automated controls we have are things that are set up within systems to prevent people from accessing certain components of a system, maybe that don't relate to their job. That's referred to, we call it segregation of duties, right? We only want them to be able to access what they need to do for their duties. Another very common one that everybody runs into just in work or in the world or whatever is physical access control. So badges, that's an automated control, right? You're setting up somebody's access rights to what buildings they can get into, and nobody is having to manually review who logged or signed in at the front desk necessarily, but there's a computer system behind that is denying access to somebody who's not supposed to be there. So
yeah, and I love that, and I love that you could use that example to show the automated control around the process, and then maybe there's a manual review or control on the back end that says, hey, here are the 10 people we didn't recognize or that shouldn't have tried to badge in this one location, and then you can investigate those outliers. So I think it gives examples of how one automated control can still need maybe a manual control at the end.
Yeah, it's not uncommon to have a manual review of what we call exceptions to an automated control.
Yeah, those like outputs, right? I think there's different in IT world. I know, and when we talk about IT controls specifically, there's input controls and processing controls and output controls. So lots of different categories we'll get into in a later module there. And I think real quick, I just want to touch on for the students. There's different types of high level controls, similar to how we talked about risks. Some companies or organizations will talk about controls as in these are financial controls. So you might hear the term internal controls over financial reporting. And those are most called SOX controls, Sarbanes-Oxley controls, where public companies have to have those financial controls in place to make sure that their financial statements are accurate. And then I say you kind of broaden that to the entire organization and you have more operational controls. So that gets into the nuts and bolts of maybe processing different things within your organization. So that's what I sometimes refer to as operational control. And then IT controls are really the third bucket there. But all of that to me rolls up into the internal controls within an organization. And one other, just because as I'm talking out loud, entity level controls are another set of controls that we often have. Jennifer, maybe you can give us some examples of what you have at your organization, but I think of things like having an ethics policy and having people sign off on it every year. That is a very high level organizational or entity level control too.
Yep, those back from my accounting days, those tone at the top type things, right? Policy and procedure. The ethics hotline or integrity hotline, those are pretty common ones for local government, for companies too. In my time at PwC, you mentioned SOX controls, external auditors, which is what I was at that time. We spent a lot of our energy and effort, during the year testing those controls that ensure that their financial information is accurate. If those controls fail, then we know we have a problem and that we might have to do more work to evaluate the numbers they're giving us. But yeah, they're nothing different. We have external auditors for our financials here too at the local government level.
Yeah, and depending on, external auditors, yes, they're probably looking at those financial controls. Depending on the audit or engagement that you're doing, you are looking at different types of controls within a project, obviously all these different types. And one other thing I just want to mention, more of just an FYI, Jennifer and I hadn't even really talked about this, is the difference between a key and a compensating control, which we don't talk about a lot, I feel like, anymore. It was really, really important when we were all implementing these controls, you know, within our organizations when it was new. Sarbanes-Oxley was what, like 2004 now, I think. So it's been a while. But, you know, something like a key control is going to be your main control that's going to mitigate that risk. But if that fails, in other words, it doesn't work, some of the terminology we use is that maybe it's ineffective, or, you know, really, we talk about it, controls failing, right? Control failure. Yeah. Then we go to those compensating controls. What else was in place that may have caught that? And so
the backup plan.
The backup plan, exactly. So I think that's another way to look at, like, our automated controls might be our key controls. Then we might have a manual mitigating, or, you know, or compensating, or secondary, primary or secondary, I've seen it called too, right? So yeah, see, I'm thinking of things as we talk.
Bringing back by public accounting days too.
I know, right? How do you keep track? We talked about this, we mentioned it briefly in the risk module. So how do you keep track of controls that align with risks across your organization?
So you mentioned it in the last session, but something that we call a risk control matrix. So when we go through the process of identifying all those risks, and we kind of, you know, keep a running list of them, right? Well, then we go, well, what do you put in place to make sure this doesn't happen?
Yeah.
And, you know, we talk through the business process and help the departments identify if those are controls. Well, then you have to document that there's this process in place related to this risk. So think of like giant Excel spreadsheet with all the risks and all the individual controls that help mitigate that risk.
Yeah, and I look at that as, I mean, that is a key document when we start talking about planning and engagement in one of our future modules. That's going to really come into play, and you're going to see how that's almost the backbone of where we start an engagement.
Yep, and having that all kind of documented in one location, and it is really important when you have to make a decision on what you're going to test and what you're going to leave behind, because you can't do it all.
Yes.
So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. You bring in kind of another layer of things, which is assessing, right, those risks and controls. So some organizations, you might see them, you know, almost rank their risks and controls, and that's how we prioritize, because we can't do everything, right?
So here at Peoria, we did, I'm a team of one. I did a citywide risk assessment. So we've got about 16 departments. That changes a little bit year to year based on the departments that kind of come together, and if we break them up or whatever. But each of those departments, we went through a risk assessment process where I sat down with the directors and the managers, and we talked through, you know, everything that they did and where the risks lied, and all of the controls that they had in place. And so to try and catalog all of that is, you know, it's an undertaking.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're going to talk about that in a future module, so I'm going to leave us right there. Do you have any other thoughts, though, on controls for the students? I know my main thing is think about how you have controls in your own life, like literally locking our front door at night or our car. Those are controls that we've put into place personally. So again, don't let this biz speak of risks and controls daunt you at all, because we use these type of things in our own lives every day. Like you said, reconciling our own bank account, right?
Yep, that's a good example of a personal one for sure. And I think keeping it simple and not being afraid, like you said, the biz speak, that makes you a better auditor and a better you know, contributor to your organization when you can.
Yeah, and people, I think just really making it simple, like you said, for them, because they might be like, what do you mean? What do I do as a control? So just saying like, well, what do you do so that the money doesn't go out the door, right?
Yep,
so, it's that simple. And so when you are talking later in your careers to business people, you know, make sure you are using terminology that they understand, right? They control their process somehow, and it's just getting that information out of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much for being with us for this talk on internal controls, and we'll see you again for a later module.
Sounds good. Thanks.